What do you think, if you had to create a class for any grade level from 9th grade to the end of college, what would the class be and when would you teach it? And I'm going to go grab a copy of this quote because it's going to bug me, but I'm listening.
Okay. So it's a really interesting question. Part of the problem surrounds where would I be allowed to teach this class? So first,
anywhere you like.
Well, the first question is, are you really allowed to deeply question your teacher or your school?
Yes.
So I would look to, for example, the Milgram experiment and the Asch conformity experiment. So in the Asch conformity experiment, one person was led into a room and asked simple questions, which a bunch of Confederates of the experimenter.
Confederates, those people cooperating with the experiment.
Right. Agreed to answer the question.
Actors, in fact.
Yes. The actors answer the question in an obviously wrong way. And then when it comes time for the only real participant to answer the question, they often falsify their answer just to fit in. So you should be able to pass the Asch conformity test. And then there's the Milgram obedience experiment, where an experimenter appeared to ask the only participant to administer a series of increasing electric shocks. And it's really important that most people continued to administer the shocks even when they heard screaming from the actor in that case, if they were assured that it was expected of them and that they would not be held responsible. And so I think what you're always looking for is you're looking for an education which makes students unteachable by standard methods. And this is where we get into the trouble, which is we don't talk about teaching disabilities. We talk about learning disabilities. And a lot of the kids that I want,
that's so true.
I think
such a good way to put it.
Are kids who have been labeled learning disabled, but they're actually super learners. They're like learners on steroids who have some deficits to pay for their superpower. And when teachers can't deal with this, we label those kids learning disabled to cover up from the fact that the economics of teaching require that one central actor, the teacher, be able to lead a room of 20 or more people in lockstep. Well, that's not a good model. And so what I want is I want to get as many of my dangerous kids out of that idiom, whether it requires dropping out of high school, dropping out of college, but not for no purpose. Drop into something, start creating, building, join a lab, skip college.
So this would be, what was the program? It's not 20 under 20, the scholarship program. The
Teal Fellowship.
The Teal Fellowship. Could you describe that for people who are, and how, could you describe that in brief? And then is that an example of what you're describing, or is it different?
Well, so there's a lot of confluence between how Peter thinks and how I think, even though we start from radically different places. The Teal Fellowship preexisted my coming on, and it's a program that will pay kids $100,000 over 2 years to leave college to try something, like start a company or a nonprofit or do something of high agency. And roughly speaking, a lot of the kids drop out of the Stanfords and Princetons and Harvards. They're incredibly impressive, and we're not that worried that in life they're going to be set back because they're going to do just fine under any circumstances.
And they can now, in fairness too, most of those schools will allow them to come back.
That's true, but 2 years is a little bit longer than is comfortable. A lot of people understand that there's a gap year, but one of the things that we hope is that if they do go back, they will go back maybe as graduate students. That maybe the undergraduate degree is unnecessary. In fact, we at some point did a little study, and we found that for every advanced professional degree we could think of, there was somebody who held that degree who had never gotten a BA or a BS. And so the idea of skipping college is now quite appealing to me. And with the idea being that a master's degree or a PhD or a JD or an MD has an embedded assumption of a BA or a BS, but in fact, you'll never be asked about that lower degree, because the leading degree, the professional degree credential is usually the one that matters.
Now, what would you say to those out there who might look at your credentials and say, well, how would you have been able to obtain these very helpful degrees from places like Harvard and Oxford if you hadn't had the prerequisites set by going to undergrad?
Well,
because I would imagine there are critics who would say there's a survivorship bias. Right?
Sure.
You hear about the Zuckerbergs, but you don't hear about the 999 other people who might drop out, but then end up feeling or being restricted in their career options because they can't show a college degree. That at least is a common refrain. So what would you say to those people?
Well, so my undergraduate wasn't from Oxford, it was from Penn. And there was a language requirement at the University of Pennsylvania. And I, at the time, couldn't figure out how to satisfy it. So I assumed that I would not graduate from Penn. And then I just broke all the rules. They had a program that actually helped you break all the rules if you could find it. And
I have to ask. So what did that look like?
So it looked like one guy whose name was Mike Zuckerman. He was a professor in the history department, and he's what we would call in Yiddish a Starker. He's the guy who breaks kneecaps for his people. Starker.
It's like German. Starker, like strength, like the strong guy.
That's the strong guy. And so every time I would like sign up for a class that had a prerequisite, and I would be held back, he'd get on the phone and he'd say, I understand this is Mike Zuckerman at the Office of University Scholars. I understand that you're holding one of my kids hostage with red tape. And, it wasn't like he had any power, but the sound of it caused other professors to let go. And
what was his official job? I mean, it's just like
he was a history professor.
Oh, he was. Okay. It wasn't just like the secret mercenary
I think
in the basement.
This was a brilliant idea that he thought up. And it was sort of a secret program. So you didn't know that it was there, and it had power. It allowed you to, I think, immediate access to any of Penn's graduate schools.
What was the program called?
University Scholars. So it sounded respectable.
It sounds very respectable.
Right. And it was just an anti-red tape program for kids who wanted to do research while undergraduates.
And it was created by this history professor.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. And this shows you what, all through corporate America and the Ivy League universities, there are rebels who can't quite leave these institutions, but I call it the rebel end of corporate and the corporate end of rebel. So I end up as the corporate end of rebel, but I've always had help from the rebel end of corporate. And he was a guy who was
the rebel end of corporate.
The rebel end of corporate.
He was the maverick within the machine.
That's